Yay, hello, Oakland. I feel like it's rare to get to be at a conference that's like publicly in your time zone. So I'm really enjoying this one because it hasn't required the mental gymnastics of others. So that's fun. Also from Oakland. I imagine you're in that world too. Okay. San Francisco, good. California, nice representation. San Jose. Calgary, okay, we're officially international. That's great. Utah, among the people having to do the mental gymnastics of time zone, Utah, New York, Colorado, Tucson. Oh, nice. Always great to see a shout out to Beth Waller. Lucky for the Tucson folks to get to work with her. That's awesome. Great. Perfect. Well, I'm so excited to be here with you all and invite you to keep tossing things in the chat as they occur to you. I'll try to keep an eye on it. It's always, speaking of gymnastics, always difficult to manage all the screens and everything. But if I don't speak to it in the moment, flag it and we'll hopefully have time at the end to have some conversation. So I'm here today to talk about how we do things in Seattle on our social services team. Let's see. And I have started the recording, so that is done. And of course, a big shout out and thank you to San Jose State University for putting this on, making the resources available to all of us to do this and share information and be together in this way. It's a really lovely contribution, so thank you to you all. And thanks to everybody for joining. So again, today what I'm going to do is just talk a little bit about how Seattle Public Library is approaching social services. And my goal is to talk about these three strategies that we group our work into. And this is an approach that we take for all of our social services, but of course, a large part of that is dedicated to the patrons who are experiencing homelessness. So I wanted to start by just talking about some operating assumptions that are the foundation of our work here at Seattle Public Library and sort of in the field and arena more broadly. Um, as you all know, and as we've heard today, libraries are asked to do so many things. Some of those asks are implicit, some of those are explicit. But the role of libraries, I think, historically and since their inception, has always been pretty broad and pretty vast. Libraries do everything under the sun. It seems like we've heard great examples of that today. Everything from literacy supports, citizenship, diaper pantries, health resources, food access, sewing machines, anything under the sun, probably there's a library that is doing it. And I think that that has meant more and more folks are also seeing the library as a place where they can get their social service needs met. I love this as a social worker. I love this, and I imagine most people who are attending this kind of conference do as well. But of course, that desire to fill those needs and meet those needs is not without tension. On the plus side, I think it's a really amazing hallmark of libraries that they continue to evolve in response to the changing needs of community. I think that's a really special thing about libraries. But on the flip side, it's almost impossible for one institution to be everything to everyone, right? That rubber band of capacity that we have can stretch and stretch and stretch. And I argue it should, right? We should continue to grow to encompass more services. But eventually, if we aren't thoughtful about the services that we're providing, that rubber band, I think, will break. And so, really, what I want to talk about today is how do we calibrate our rubber band to these increasing needs and do more, but also do that in a thoughtful way so that we're not breaking our capacity, overstretching our capacity. And I think in particular around the needs of folks that are experiencing homelessness, those folks already rightly rely on libraries for so many different things. And what role we can and should play is pretty big and existential. So I'm going to focus on sort of some practical strategies in hopes that that can help you all figure out sort of what your lane is as well. So just a few details about Seattle for those who are not familiar. We are a city with a very large wealth disparity. So we have exceptional wealth here, lots of tech money, a lot of millionaires, and we have many, many people living below the poverty line, many people dependent on public benefits that don't go very far in an increasingly expensive city. And interestingly, for our conversation today, both ends of that spectrum and everyone in between, I think, uses the library in many different ways, and that can create some tension and make things pretty interesting. Seattle also has a really deep legacy of inequity and inequitable policies like redlining, which prevented BIPOC folks from owning homes or property in the city for much of our history. And we're today, I think, seeing both the legacy of those old historical practices as well as coming up with new, creative, and inventive ways to discriminate against people in the modern times. So we're sort of in between both of those worlds, both historical and present day. So a lot of inequity, even outside of the wealth disparity. Then the next point is not unique to Seattle, but it bears mentioning. So social services here, just like most places, are really stretched. That is an industry that suffers from high turnover, low morale. And so those services are really being asked to do more with less. I think personally that what I see in the library is that as those other social services, more traditional social services, are being stretched more and more thinly, more and more people come to the library because they can't get that help elsewhere. So again, putting us in that position of figuring out what are we going to do to support the needs that we're seeing in our buildings. And then, as is like trotted out endlessly in national news media, we do have a really huge homelessness crisis in our city and our region. Housing is deeply unaffordable here, and so we're seeing more and more folks fall into homelessness as the housing supply is snatched up by really high income, high earners. Most of the attempts to intervene and provide housing or even shelter for folks needing that have been really ineffective. And as those policies have been rolled out, as those ideas have rolled out and have failed, it's created a lot of public sentiment about that problem. And I think about the population of folks that experience homelessness. So the library is in a position as we're serving those folks of all of that political upheaval and baggage that comes with social services and providing services for folks who are houseless. So our social services team is relatively new. Our social services librarian was hired about 2 years ago, and she was the first inaugural member of our team. We now also have 2 community resource specialists, myself and one other person, and we're trained social workers. We also have a practicum student from the School of Social Work when we're able to get one and when they're in session, when school's in session. And then we're overseen by an assistant managing librarian. We're situated in the Quick Information Center in the Central Library, which is sort of our call and chat triage center and also oversees our biggest public computer space. And we are a team that is situated in the central downtown location, but responsible for things system-wide. And we have 27 locations across the city of Seattle. So our mission as a team is to enable patrons to successfully access library services, technology, and spaces. So you'll notice that our mission is not to solve homelessness. We know that that is not sort of our purview. That's not something that we're going to be able to accomplish. What we can do is provide connection to resources, hopefully in an equitable and welcoming way, so that everyone who walks into our building or accesses things online has a chance to really take advantage of the full scope of library services, which, as we discussed before, is a lot. The library does a lot. So one kind of concrete example of what I mean by that, of sort of our tiered approach to serving homeless folks, is that I want somebody to be able to come into the library and get help on a job application from a library staff member and then be able to leverage that into getting a job. But in order to do that, they might need information about where they can get a good night of sleep. They might need a shelter referral. They might need referral to a food bank so they can have something in their stomach so they can concentrate. So our job is to think about if we can meet those needs, those practical basic needs, then their ability to take advantage of all the other wealth of resources at the library is strengthened, right? They can come to that job application appointment with a librarian more focused, more prepared. They'll be able to be much more successful in accessing those traditional, maybe more traditional library services. So we group our work into these three strategies, three approaches, which are to increase staff capacity, general staff capacity across the entire system to respond to social service needs with compassion and accurate information. To assist patrons directly. So we do direct service to access resources or navigate complex systems. And then we build connections and partnerships, as we've heard a lot about today, with organizations that are doing work in these areas as well. And one way I think about this and sort of how we've built our approach is a series of cascading buckets. So thank you to Lowe's.com for allowing me to use this garden fountain photo as a way to describe the way that we approach our services. So up here at the top, there's a pump of patron needs that are just constantly being pumped into the system, right? People are coming with questions, they're coming with needs. And our first line of defense here is always going to be our staff. It's the capacity of our staff to answer those questions. And it's most likely not going to be social services staff. It's going to be public services staff who are working at service points throughout all of those branches that are going to be on the receiving ends of those questions. So the more we can develop their capacity to answer those questions, we're making that first bucket bigger. We're allowing staff to respond more successfully to more of that inflow. But there's a line where they're not going to be the best folks to answer questions. Maybe these are complex needs. It's navigating the very notoriously nuanced social services system. And so at a certain point, that overflow, those questions that they can't answer are going to come to us, and we can provide direct service. We can help folks who might be in crisis or who might really need a social worker in the building. And then in turn, when those questions become too far outside of our scope, when the patron really needs something that's beyond the services of a library or a library social worker to provide, then it overflows into our largest bucket and sort of the foundation, which is the realm of partnerships. So if we can't provide something internally, chances are one of our partner organizations can, and then our job becomes bridging that gap between the library and that partner organization. So a little bit of a goofy graphic, but it really helps me in thinking about what are our priorities and how are we organizing our workflow. Okay, so let's talk about each of those approaches in a little bit more detail, starting with staff capacity. So 2 social workers and 1 social services librarian, and even all the practicum students in the world wouldn't be sufficient to answer all the questions that we receive, right? And we can't be everywhere at once. We are a team of 3, and we have 27 locations, so it's just not the math. The math doesn't math, as the youth, I believe, say these days. But more importantly, we really want social service questions and homeless patrons to not be like an us thing. We don't want people to refer someone to us simply because they are unhoused. We really want to think about basic social service information and referral as part of core service at all service points. What homeless patrons need or want from the library in some circumstances is no different than what anyone else needs, right? Just because they're unhoused, it doesn't mean that they want to use the library differently necessarily. So like a patron shouldn't be referred to me just because I'm a social worker because they're homeless if their question is about reader advisory, right? But that reader advisory interaction may be more successful if that librarian or library staffer has a grounding in homelessness, what causes homelessness, the challenges that folks who are facing homelessness face. And that is something that our staff, that our team can provide. Let me go one back. So library workers, as you all know, probably better than me, library workers have been doing this for a really long time. You all have been working with this population for a long time. It's always been part of our work. But what hasn't been necessarily there, at least at Seattle Public Library, is institutional support and backing that comes from a centralized place, like having an in-house someone or someone's that you can go to with questions in this realm. And that's what our team can do. So we coordinate resources and information. We filter that like never-ending stream of emails and postings and resource blogs, and then distill it down into like what information do library staff across our system need to know, and then how can we provide centralized support for learning that information, distilling that information into digestible ways for patrons to learn it, and that kind of thing. So a few concrete examples of that approach in action. We provide training for staff, or we will. We're working now on building like a full suite of staff training that would be everything from decoding the Seattle shelter system to compassion fatigue, burnout, and really putting like a Seattle Public Library specific spin on those things so that it's really concretely available and accessible to our particular staff. Another thing that we do is provide both resource maps for that can be used across the system. So again, distilling that information down into key information for patrons, and that can be used as templates for branch staff. So a lot of branch staff have great relationships with the resources in their community, but we might be able to give them a template that can help them organize that information so that they're not having to reinvent the wheel in creating a food pantry map or something like that. And then one of the last things we do to kind of build staff capacity and increase communication around it is we convene a work group with representatives from all of our regions and some of the key centralized units as well. And that forms kind of a two-way communication stream. So we can disseminate information out about maybe upcoming trainings or resources within the city that are new or changing or evolving. And then as well, we can hear back from branches and regions, what's going on, what does staff need, how can we be more accountable to them, more responsive to the needs that they are articulating to us. So then moving to our next bucket of direct service, our two community resource specialists, so myself and my colleague, and then our practicum students, when we have them, are available to provide resource navigation. So we, like many other folks in our realm, do skirt that case management boundary and try to focus on sort of resource navigation, referral, and information, and really helping people understand what resources are available to them and how to mitigate barriers that might stand in the way of them accessing those. We want to work particularly with patrons who have complex or like specifically social worky needs, for lack of a better phrase, those who might be in crisis. And that's again going back to our hope that the questions that overflow into our bucket are not those that could have been easily addressed by another staff member. It's not pointing someone to the nearest clothing bank. It's really thinking about how can we focus our time on the challenges we're uniquely able to address as trained social workers, with the hopes that some of those more basic questions have already been answered by our colleagues. So some direct service examples. One thing when we talk about crisis help, one thing that I think about is that we have, as social workers, we have the ability to work maybe more in depth with someone who might be running up against maybe one of our rules of conduct, right? So maybe they are having a hard time staying awake and they keep getting woken up by our security. We might be able to intervene and prevent that person from being excluded from the library by working maybe at more length with them, maybe working privately with them away from the scrutiny of the public floor, things like that. So we might be able to both intervene and avoid crisis, but also work with people who are maybe needing a little bit more time than someone who is staffing a desk or someone who's on security would be able to provide to us or to the patron. We also do the bulk of shelter referrals for the downtown region. We have relationships with a city team that holds beds in some shelters, and we can sometimes make referrals there. But making referrals into shelter is so difficult in Seattle. It is so decentralized and really challenging and time consuming. And so again, it's just not something that a lot of desk staff have time to do. So we try to work on those to really make sure that that relationship and that referral is compassionate and centering that person's humanity as much as possible and giving them the time that something as serious as seeking shelter really requires. We also have like a gentle outreach approach. So like many folks, we offer a coffee and conversations program that is intended largely for the patrons who stay outside of our downtown library and are kind of there first thing queuing up to come in when our building opens. And it's just been a really lovely way for us to connect with those patrons and to say, to them explicitly, like, this is for you. This is a time that is uniquely for you, and that we really welcome you. It's not just that you're tolerated, it's that you're welcome, that we want you here and we want to hear from you. And it's really formed a great way to cultivate longer term relationships, while not being like intrusively in people's businesses, like, hey, I'm a social worker, but rather, hey, I'm here if you have questions now or in the future. You now have made a connection with us that we can further. And then last but not least, or last but most importantly, is our partnerships. So a lot of course, what people need is beyond the scope of the library to provide. Unfortunately, so for instance, like we can't provide housing case management. I mentioned we don't do case management, so we don't provide housing case management. But more importantly, I think our goal is not really to become a housing case management organization, but that doesn't mean that we don't have a responsibility to make sure that someone can access that service. It just means that we're not the right provider for that need. And then our job becomes connecting the dots between that person, their need, and then the right kind of delivery mechanism for that. So that, of course, starts with hearing from folks about what they need. What among those needs can we fill and what can't we do? So going back to the beginning, thinking about like, where does the capacity of our rubber band stretch beyond capacity? Where would it break? And for those things that are kind of beyond that stretching capacity, we then would take it upon ourselves to identify the right resources to fill those gaps and vet those resources. So thinking about what services are out there, what do they provide, how are they providing their service? Are they doing that in a trauma-informed way, in a way that I would feel good about referring someone that I care about as a library patron into that system? And then thinking about how can we build those connections and coordinate all of those moving parts to really help patrons and streamline the process of them accessing what is often disparate services as easily as possible. So a few ways that we approach partnership. We love to take field trips. So we like to visit all of the key partner locations that we refer people to. This helps us like have FaceTime with the staff so that when I refer somebody, I'm not referring them like to the Salvation Army, but I'm referring them to Martrell, right? It also helps when I'm telling someone, okay, you're going to get on the bus, you're going to get off the bus, you're going to take a right, you're going to look for the door with the little blue buzzer, to have that level of detail so that I can really understand what it will mean for someone to move from the library to that off-site location and the steps that are the hurdles that are going to be involved in them accessing that. So we do a lot of referring out based on our field trips. We also invite partners to come in on site. Again, as we've heard about today, a great model so that patrons don't have to travel for the things that they need, but they can get them on site where they're already spending a lot of their time. Some examples of the things that we bring on site: we have a mobile medical van for healthcare for the homeless that comes. We've done housing voucher signups. We do regular reduced fare transit passes. We've had some substance use counseling. So things like that that we feel like are broadly applicable to a pretty wide audience. And sometimes those partners set up like a one-time pop-up. Sometimes they come to coffee and conversations, which is a lovely way to, again, have it be informal, very low barrier to entry. And then, like so many other people, we've also done resource fairs and things like that, where we concentrate those partners and hopefully get people connected to lots of things that they might need in a short period of time. Okay, so that was quick and breezy. I want to leave a few time for questions, hopefully, but a few takeaways. So my biggest takeaway, and I am still new to this work. I'm still thinking about this. So this is where I'm at today, but in a year, maybe things will be different. But when I'm thinking about how the library can be a better support for homeless folks, I have to remind myself that being supportive doesn't mean that we have to do it all ourselves, or even that we should. I think our job is really to figure out where can our rubber band of capacity stretch. What are those wonderful examples that we've heard about today of ideas that people have found ways to beautifully integrate into the library? Where can that stretching of our capacity take place? But then where also is beyond our capacity? Where do we need to ask for help? What's beyond our scope? And then how can we not just stop there, but rather think, okay, that's beyond the scope of the library, but we want to find a way to provide that to our patrons. So I think one way to like navigate that line and figuring out where can I stretch, where will I break, is to return to that mission that you have as a library system or as a team. So again, our goal is not as a team is not to end homelessness, though that is my like beautiful, deep personal aspiration. That's not my goal as a team, right? So again, thinking, what do we want to do? What's the role that we can play? And then what are those strategies that we can use to complement it? So the way that you meet these needs, the way that we all pull together to meet the needs of our community is never to do it alone or to use a single strategy. So no single approach is going to be perfect, either library system to library system or even within a single system. Of course, what works in Seattle is not necessarily going to work in a rural environment and vice versa. And we have, we're using these 3 tiers of approach because we know that staff capacity alone is not going to do it. Direct service alone is not going to do it. Partnerships alone is not going to do it. So we're not relying on a single bucket to catch that flood of patron needs that's coming in through that pump, right? We're thinking about, okay, what are the approaches that we need? How do they work together? And then how individually can we strengthen each of those buckets to hold more and more capacity, and then overflow when is necessary. So that's the end of what I have. I'll leave this up for a moment in case you want to call me maybe or email me later. And then let me see in the chat, can you share resource maps or templates? Yes, I would love to do that. I will, maybe Melissa, if you can email me or if anyone else wants an email. I'm just trying to think if we have anything on our website that's publicly available. We just suffered a cyber attack, so our web resources are fairly limited right now. So maybe if you're interested in some examples of the resource maps we've developed, just shoot me an email and I'll happily send along some of the ones that we have created. And then next question, if you have someone in crisis at another branch, will you deploy one of your team or have them call a crisis line? Yes, great question. So we currently do not deploy ourselves. We're hoping that in a beautiful, more resourced future, we will be able to have regional social workers who would be able to respond in a more timely manner. Right now, our challenge is not that we don't want to deploy, but it's really about time between like a crisis happening and our ability to get there. And so we do kind of going to one of the other questions, we do have a security team at the library that is much bigger than our team is. And so if people are in crisis at another branch and consulting with us on the phone isn't a good option for the branch staff, or we've exhausted that, they will probably call security, and security has their own vehicles and they can sort of, and they are, some of them are roaming within our system already. So that's a little bit more of a timely response than we would be. But in a dream world in the future, I would love to be more deployable. And then how are we using practicum students? It'll depend on whether the student is a first year social work student or a second year social work student. One of the things that we feel comfortable having second year students do is hold drop-in hours at branches in like a team of 2. And so that really expands our capacity and allows us to go to other branches. So that's our like dream future again, is to have second year students. With first year students, we've largely had them work on direct service in our central building because we can be there on site as the two trained social workers to provide supervision and assistance when they're working one-on-one with patrons, or to focus on programming or projects. So our practicum student this year did like a big research project on overdoses in the library, looked at all of our incident logs, and really brought together information about that and how we could better respond as a library system in the future. Okay, and then last, I know we all want to leave to go to the keynote, but do we work closely with the safety team? We do. We have a security team, as I mentioned. There's 21 security officers. We work most closely with sort of the leadership of the security team, and thinking about again, like what's our lane, what's their lane, and how can we collaborate on sort of training and then reiterating best practices to our staff. But yeah, it's an area for more development in the future. So we're excited to hopefully strengthen that connection as well. Okay, well, thank you so much. I appreciate you all being here. Thank you for the great questions. And please be in touch if you have ideas about what we could be doing better or differently, or things that that you have found to be really successful. I am always learning from other people, and I love that. So don't hesitate to be in touch. And thanks so much for being here today. Take care. Bye bye.